Well, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be with you. The only way I could be more pleased is if I were actually with you. I understand Varna is a beautiful, beautiful place, and someday I hope to visit you. Today we want to talk about a wide variety of business aspects, because to be an entrepreneur requires a leader to be very proficient, very good in many different topics. And we have to understand everything if we're an entrepreneur. In a very large corporation, we have to understand everything there too, but you have people who are specialists and who do the accounting function, and who do the human resource function, and who do the marketing function. But for an entrepreneur, that person usually starts out having to do all of them. And so you have to be very knowledgeable in many subjects to be a successful entrepreneur. Now, I'm going to switch at this point to my slides. If everything goes correct, you will see that. And if it is functioning the way it should, you see a slide that says price, costs, and entrepreneurs. If that's not happening, then somebody tell me and I'll do something different. But when you do entrepreneurship success...
The slideshow isn't showing up yet. Have you switched over?
Okay, good. And you see the screen with the slides instead of me, correct?
That's correct.
And that's probably a good thing. So, yes, when you do entrepreneurship well, three things happen. One, you enlarge the prosperous middle class. Now, all around the world today, there's great concern about the prosperity of the middle class. Here in the U.S. and other places, it's declining. Well, how do you make it, how do you take the lower middle class and make them upper middle class in prosperity? And the answer is through entrepreneurship. When you also take small firms and build them into much larger firms, you create large fortunes for families. And when you do both of those, you create jobs and you increase the gross domestic product growth rate, and that bootstraps the economy. So that's why taking ideas from profits is the key. Now, we can talk about both macroeconomics and microeconomics. Macro has to do with the overall economy. The economy has two purposes. There are two functions to be achieved in the economy. One, to produce the maximum amount of goods and services. Now, economies change over the decades, and I've just published an article about Europe in the 1800s, when it went from an agricultural society in countries like Germany and England and France and others to an industrial society, and then finally went to a consumer society. And this is three basic stages that all economies move through in the market system. And the goal is to produce as much as you can in agriculture. That gives people more food than they need, so then they can produce industrial goods, and usually they export some of those, and that increases the ability to have consumer goods, cars or clothing or whatever. The process is happening in many countries. I just taught in Bangladesh not long ago, and 25, 30 years ago, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. And everybody lived on the farm and grew their own products. Well, they have moved to Dhaka, and it's a little bit larger country. Physically, it's not much bigger than Bulgaria, but it has 160 million people, more than Russia, in that country. Not too much different than the size of Bulgaria. And all those people live in the city, and they work in industrial plants, exporting mainly apparel items, and that creates many millions of poor people, but they're poor enough, but they're rich enough to buy food and cars and refrigerators and clothing, and that makes the GDP grow. So the economy has the purpose of producing goods and services, and you want to do as many as possible. And then it decides who gets them. And there are two basic systems in the world. One says that the people who get them should be the ones who make them, who contribute to creation. And other system says to those according to their need, whether they had anything to do with making them or not. You understand the two basic systems. The market system always produces more goods and services for people. So people might not like the fact that everybody gets unequal amounts, but nevertheless, there's more distributed, or to distribute. Now, what should the price of a product be? Should it be based on cost? Traditionally, people said, well, the way you price goods, whether we're talking at the factory or the retail store, would be based upon cost. But you might say, really, it should be based on value. And that's the correct way to think about it. The only role cost should determine the price is to set the lower floor of price. And even then, there might be exceptions where we would price less than cost. And in retailing, that's called a loss leader. A firm might price something for a short time less than its cost, but they hope people will come to the store or from that particular factory and buy the one that they lose money on, but they'll buy other things. And that's called loss leader. But in the long run, you don't want to price below cost. What you do really want to price upon is value. In a way, you can say if something has a value of 10 units of the currency, and people are only paying 5, then the people who created it are getting cheated. And if it's the other way around, if people are only willing to pay 5 and it costs 10 units to produce it, then the producer is getting cheated. So in the long run, you want to sell any item for its value. And that may or may not be above cost, but in the long run, it has to be above cost, of course. Now, that puts the people who buy things in charge of the economy. Every once in a while people will say, well, somebody should take charge of our economy. Here in the United States, we hear people say, Obama should make the economy better. Or we say Parliament should make the economy better. Or the Federal Reserve. Well, none of those three entities have the ability to control the economy. 70% of everything that happens in the economy is determined by people called consumers. And I was fortunate many years ago to write a book with 2 of my colleagues called Consumer Behavior. It's now in its 10th edition. I don't think it's translated into Bulgarian. If there's anybody there who reads Russian, there is a Russian translation of it. There's, I guess, maybe it's selling a little bit in Ukraine than it was, perhaps. That's probably not a good joke, though, is it? The Consumer Behavior book, and there are others written by other professors, really explains why people buy the things they buy. And they do that, and they are the ones that control the economy. Now, businesses who know what people will buy are the ones who have to interpret that demand. But here in the U.S., 70% of everything that happens in the economy is determined by consumers. And all business demand is derived from consumer demand. So an entrepreneur who runs a business-to-business, or B2B firm, really has to focus on his or her customers' customers. And your competitors are probably focusing on their customers. But you get an edge over your competitors if you focus not only on your customers, but your customers' customers, because you know what your customers will need before your competitors will. So that's why we study consumer demand, and that's who determines the future of the economy. Now, we have 317 million of those in the United States. I believe you have around a little over 7 million of those. And the Bulgarian population is doing the same thing as the U.S. population, part of the U.S. population. It's declining. Now, our total U.S. population is still increasing, but not among young people. We're having less and less children every year, and we go up in total population because of people like myself, who just live longer and longer. And that influences what people buy, of course. And as you get an older population, it becomes more female. And there have been many theories about why females live longer than males, but the fact is that's true in Bulgaria, it's true in the United States, it's true nearly every place in the world. And that influences demand also. So, how much money do people have to spend, and what will they spend it on is determined by their values. And in the long run, values determine what the prices of a product should be. Now, when we use the word values, we define that as shared beliefs or group norms internalized by an individual. It's the way people behave. And there's two different kinds. Their words are called terminal values. And these are words. And people say, I believe you should be honest. I believe you should work hard. I believe we should not pollute the environment. Those are words. But instrumental values are determined by what people actually do. Now, from an entrepreneur standpoint, the behavior of the team will determine the success of the firm. And that's true whether you're talking about an individual enterprise, and there was a very famous book written called Built to Last by Collins and Forrest. There was another book, not quite as famous, called From the Edge of the World, written by a professor named Bлекуел. And I actually went to 14 countries and studied why are the people of some countries rich and some poor. And the answer, if you ask people, why are some countries rich and some poor? There are people who will say, well, it would be natural resources. Don't ever believe that. It is not natural resources. Because if you look at natural resources, which nation has more natural resources than any in the world? And the answer, of course, is a country closer to you than to me, named Russia. And the countries with the most natural resources include Nigeria, and nobody would call that one of the richest countries in the world. Brazil, also rich in natural resources. It is interesting that the countries with the most natural resources, some of them are among the poorest in the world. And the countries, well, what are the richest countries in the world? And the answer is Qatar, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Bermuda, Norway, Singapore. Look at Singapore. Singapore, the people in GDP per capita average $10,000 more than the people in the United States. Well, I can tell you that the United States has a lot more resources than Singapore. And it has a lot more land, too. Or you look at countries like the Netherlands. Do you find any oil in the Netherlands? They don't even have land. They had to make up their own land in the Netherlands. And the countries that don't have a whole lot of resources are the richest in the world. And the countries that have a lot of resources are among the poorest. And the answer for why is written in a book called From Third World to First by Lee Kuan Yew. And I wish I could see hands here. But let me ask you, everybody in the room who has been to Singapore, raise your hand, please. Any hands up there? I can't see it. Okay.
No hands were raised.
No hands. Well, if there were, I would say it's a dirty country, right? No, it's not a dirty country. There is no dirt in Singapore. There is no crime in Singapore. And there is no poverty in Singapore. But it is the cleanest country you could ever imagine. They don't even have any chewing gum lying around or cigarette butts because they just don't have any dirt. I've jogged there many times, and I've never seen an empty wrapper or bottle or anything like that on the ground. And one of the things you can take to the bank is that the countries that are the cleanest are also among the richest. The Switzerlands, the Netherlands, the Singapores of the world, they're among the richest, and one of the correlates of that is that they are among the cleanest. My mother always told me it doesn't cost much to buy soap. And that's a value. Now, Lee Kuan Yew took a country called Singapore that was one of the poorest in the world 50 years ago. It was a malaria-infested swamp. And he changed the values of the people. And when he changed the values of the people, he changed the prosperity of the nation. Now, if you look at the world's poorest nations, they're the ones that have values that do not take advantage of their resources. Countries like Nigeria, with a very low income, even though it has a very high amount of resources. Or Russia is just slightly above the world average, even though it has more resources than anyone. These are the poorest countries in the world. And you'll notice one in red, Haiti. Haiti is one of the poorest countries in the world, but here's the interesting historical fact. If you go back to 1800, Haiti was the richest country in the Western Hemisphere. In North and South America, Haiti had more, this little tiny country, had more wealth than all of the 13 U.S. colonies combined. But you see, in 1805, they changed their values. And they cut up all the land and gave everybody an equal amount. And, of course, that began the decline of the country. Because when everybody is equal, you have mass poverty. The inevitable consequence of equality among all citizens is poverty. And here's the controversial statement, but it can be backed up with facts. The inevitable consequence of prosperity is inequality. And as nations get more prosperous, they will also get more unequal in the distribution of that wealth. And there is a book just published recently called Why Nations Fail by Akamoglu and Robinson, a Harvard professor and an MIT professor. And what they do is provide data to back up the statement that I just made. And they give examples by studying countries with the same resource base but different values. And those are countries like South Korea and North Korea. They have the same language, the same geography, the same everything really, except they have different values. And as a consequence of that, South Korea created incentives for entrepreneurs, and North Korea did not do that, and they created famine. If you reward innovation, you get prosperity, as South Korea has. When you have political repression, you get the kind of economy that North Korea has. When you allow everyone to participate in entrepreneurial opportunities, you get prosperity. When the government is dominated, the only people who get prosperity are people in the government. And the book Why Nations Fail calls the one on the left inclusive societies, though they include the entrepreneurs. But the societies that have the extractive elite have mass poverty and only a very few people who have prosperity. And the other examples of there are the United States versus Mexico. See, U.S. and Mexico, one of them had Spanish values, one of them had English values. the one that had the most natural resources was Mexico and all of South America. They had gold and all kinds of things. The United States did not have that, but they had different values. And that's why the U.S. is more prosperous today than most any of the Southern American countries. It's the same between Zimbabwe and Botswana. They have pretty much the same language, very similar, and they have the same geography, and there's more resources in Zimbabwe than Botswana. Zimbabwe is one of the poorest countries in the world, and Botswana has the fastest growth in its GDP per capita of any country in the world since 1965. So, if you want to get the Bulgarian GDP above $4,634, which was the last number I could see, it's the values that will determine the difference. It causes individual firms to prosper, it causes nations to prosper. So how is the economy? Everybody has to examine that. I do seminars for executives of small and medium-sized firms all over the United States. I do 40 or 50 or more of those a year. And I ask them this question: is the economy very good, good, bad, or very bad? And we get all kinds of answers. And then I give the numbers. After I explain, when you talk about the economy, you have to be clear about what you mean. What is the economy? And there are two different variations of the same thing. The economy is money value. If it doesn't have money associated with it, it's not part of the economy. If somebody sews their own clothing, that's not part of the economy. You might say, well, it should be. Well, it isn't. It's only when you exchange money. And in most nations of the world, there is an underground economy when people barter and change things and don't exchange money. In Greece, some people believe that's 50% of the economy. Here in the U.S., it's about $2 trillion, it's estimated, of underground economy. Things like drugs, of course, but not necessarily illegal things like hiring people to mow the lawn and not reporting it, and things like that. Now, GNP and GDP are different. Gross national product is how much money value associated with the goods produced by, in our case, U.S. firms. If a U.S. firm goes to Bulgaria and produces goods in a factory there, that is part of our GNP. If a Bulgarian firm comes to the U.S. and builds a factory and produces things here, that is part of our GDP, or domestic product. And a long time ago, most people focused on GNP, but you don't hear that very often today. It's mostly GDP because that's what affects jobs domestically. Now, what's happened over the decades? And we can look at the U.S. economy and China and several others and get some revealing insights about where the future of the Bulgarian economy will go. In 2012, the U.S. economy was about 16 trillion. We don't know what it was last year because it takes 2 years to find out, to measure it accurately. But over the decades, it's looked like this. The economy was growing, and then in 1975, it started growing very, very rapidly. And if I were there in person, I would call on somebody and say, why? Why would you say the economy started growing so fast in the 70s and 80s? And Roger, somebody,
would you
is
like
anybody
to get an answer for you?
Yes. What would people say would be the reason?
Why do you think the economy started growing more rapidly in the 70s and 80s? This is the U.S. economy.
Yes.
One answer is because something was invented.
Well, inventions help, things like the cotton gin, and there was a computer invented around about that time. That helped, but that wasn't the biggest reason.
I think I heard another response.
New technologies.
New technology, I heard.
Yeah. Well, no, something pretty old.
Other responses?
Well, I'll give you a clue. I'll give you a clue. In 1975, 8% of all married women had a job outside the home. But by the year 2000, 80% of married women had a job outside the home. And the reason the GDP grew so fast was because all the things that used to be made in the home, like taking care of children, cleaning homes, cooking food, making clothes, none of those were counted in the GDP. If Mrs. Smith lived across the street from Mrs. Jones, and each one cleaned their own houses and took care of their own children, that had nothing to do to contribute to the economy. But if each one walked across the street and cleaned the other person's home and cooked their food and charged $100 a week to do that, the economy would have doubled overnight. It didn't double overnight, it doubled over 30 or 40 years. Now this same process happened earlier in much of Europe. When people went from the farm to the city, it does the same thing, like what's happening in Bangladesh right now. But in the US, this great growth of producing things for our own consumption and then switching them to having somebody else make what we eat and take care of our children in what's called daycare centers, that makes the GDP grow. And once you get to about 80% of all the married women having a job outside the home, it can't grow much anymore. And that's why Europe and the US cannot have rapid growth like they've had in the past. Now, where would you put China in there? And my answer is someplace around where about 1980 is on the US one. The Chinese economy will only grow about 7.5% this year. Well, that's compared to less than 2% for the US and most of Europe. But that's the way it should be. You can't change that. If you're a small country like Singapore, you might. Qatar, the UAE, there's some things you can do. But big countries like China and the US, you can't change that. And 7.5% is pretty rapid growth. But where would you put India? And the answer is probably back around 1965 or 1970. But here's the difference between India and China. The Chinese population will not grow much in the future because of the one-child policy. But the Indian population will grow from its current 1.2 billion to about 2 billion by the year 2050. And so Chindia will be 3.5 billion people. Now, the United States has 300 million people. The United States will be a tiny fly speck in the world compared to Chindia. And Russia has only 160 million people. And whoever has the dominant economy to go along with the population, and that's what's beginning to happen in China and India, of course, gets to dominate the world. So look toward Chindia in the future for entrepreneurial opportunities. Well, it's not even the future. The fastest selling car in the world by brand is the Ford Focus. But Ford gets over a quarter of their sales from China. And you might notice in this slide that the number 4 best-selling car in the world is a Wuling Chihuahua. Does anybody there in Bulgaria have a Wuling? Nobody in the US does either. But it's the fourth best-selling car in the world. We have somebody there with a Wuling?
Anybody have a Wuling? No, you were correct. Nobody has a Wuling.
Yeah, and nobody here in the US does either. So we'll have to go to China if we want one of those. But the interesting thing is the number 3 in the world is the best-selling car or vehicle in the US, the Ford F-Series, which is a pickup. So if you were in the US, the number 1 selling car in this country is a Ford F-Series pickup truck. And we even have songs talking about, there's something about a pickup man. But my point is that you have to look at the global economy to see the opportunities today. And since 1960, China's real income per person has gone up 8-fold. And Brazil's has increased 5 times, India's by 4. And this is a very significant result. There are half as many poor people in the world today as there were in 1990. And that's largely because of the BRICS nations. B stands for Brazil, R stands for Russia, I stands for India, C stands for China, and S stands for South Africa, or really the sub-Saharan Africa, including Botswana. But the reality is, the world will never eliminate poverty. You know, sometimes people say, our goal is to eliminate poverty. Well, if you hear somebody say that, you're listening to a naive person. But it doesn't mean that it can't be reduced. And in fact, that's exactly what's happened. Half as many since 1990. That's pretty substantial progress, really. Now, people here in the U.S. say, okay, the GDP is increasing, and it is. Our GDP is now higher than any time ever in the history. It's the red line. We've never been producing as many things in this country and selling as many things as we did last year. It dropped a little bit in 08 and 09, but now it's back better than ever. And sometimes people say, well, yes, but everything's made in China today. Are you making anything? And the answer is yes. Manufacturing is greater output from factories than ever in the history. And I would encourage you to think about what's happening in your own country. I don't have those numbers. If I were there in person, I would have found them before I went. But I suspect what will happen, if it hasn't already happened, is the same thing that's happening in the U.S. Because people say, well, if manufacturing is making so many things in factories, why don't we have more jobs? And the answer is, since 1997, the number of jobs and the number of output keeps going up every year, but the number of jobs keep going down every year. Back in the 1990s, we crossed between jobs and output. And as a country who is prosperous, continues to be prosperous, it has to eliminate the jobs. And you might say, well, I thought all the jobs went to China. No, they didn't. This chart is very interesting. I've asked many American citizens, what percentage of things are made that we buy in the U.S. in China? And you get things like 50, 60, 70% as their guesses. But in fact, it's only 2.7% of U.S. consumer spending. And only 1.2% of what we actually pay the Chinese. And that's because over on the left side, you see what percentage of food and beverages we buy from China, and it's nothing. We don't. Petroleum and coal, the same thing. The two biggest expenditures for energy and food, we don't buy any of that from China, and we don't buy much of it from the rest of the world. Even the U.S. is now energy independent. We make enough oil and gas to take care of all our needs. In fact, we have so much oil and gas that we're trying to sell it to the rest of the world because we have more than we need. And you know, Russia and the U.S. both have quite a bit of gas, and the question is who's going to get to sell it. If you look at this in terms of oil, we have a law in the United States that makes it illegal to sell our oil to other countries. But there is an exception if it's refined into gasoline or to petrol. Then we can sell it. And so guess what's happening to our oil today? We're refining more of it into petrol to sell to the airlines for jet fuel. Now, to say that we don't import much from China is not very comforting to people over on the extreme right of this chart, where you see apparel, footwear, and accessories, because we get about half of that from China. And so if you're a computer manufacturer or electronics manufacturer, in television sets and so forth, or footwear, it's not very comforting to say we only get 2.7% of our goods from China. Now, 80% of everything that's manufactured in China is sold domestically to their own consumers. You know, if you remember that slide earlier, I said 70% of the U.S. economy is run by consumers. Well, in China, you would say, well, the government runs the businesses there. Yes, but increasingly, it's the consumers there also. And that's one of the big differences between Bulgaria in the distant past, in the Soviet era, and today, of course. And here's what every entrepreneur in Bulgaria, and China, and everywhere else has to ask. What's happening to the output per worker in our country? In the U.S., in 1947, adjusted for inflation, the average worker produced $19,500 of output in a factory. Today, that same worker, well, you see, I could correctly say he, back in 1950, produced 19,000. Today, that same worker, he or she may be producing, on average, is producing 156,000. And many of the factory workers, in fact, are female now. Because in the past, your ability to be a factory worker was influenced by upper body strength. And typically, men have more upper body strength. Today, you don't have to be able to lift heavy things to work in a factory. You have to be able to push buttons intelligently. And so a factory worker could very well be a woman instead of a man. And because of all that productivity, the buttons that they push instead of lifting boxes, the productivity is increased dramatically. Compared with 1990, the total value of U.S. manufacturing output is up 75%. And that was in 2010, it's more than that now. If you tried to get a railroad car, if you ran a factory in the U.S., tried to get a railroad car, you would have difficulty doing it today because the factories are spinning out so much output. Now, if you look at the chart, you see that China and U.S. have rapid growth, but countries like Japan, Germany, UK, France have very slow growth. Korea, and that means South Korea, has faster than others, but you'll notice how fast the Chinese economy is growing because they're just moving, currently, all these people from the farms to the cities, which makes their GDP just escalate rapidly. And having women work also. In fact, they're building the cities so fast they're not even matching them up correctly. Some of the cities are way overcrowded and others are not. But you look at those charts and you'll say, wow, that was in 2010. I'll bet you sometime soon the manufacturing output of China will exceed that of the U.S. And the answer is yes, it will. Now, the difference between jobs and output is enormous. In 1950, 31% of our employment, non-foreign employment, was in manufacturing. Today, it's under 9%. Why? What it took 1,000 workers to produce in 1950 could be produced with 177 workers in 2010. How is that happening in your country? You want to be a successful entrepreneur. You must look at the data for your own country, for your own company, and ask this question. Is the productivity of your firm increasing as rapidly as the productivity of your customers? Now, I didn't say of your competitors, that's true also, but you must be increasing your output relative to input faster, at least as fast, and hopefully faster than the productivity increases of your customers. If not, the demise of your firm is in the future. Now, if you are exporting to Turkey or to Romania or wherever, you must ask that same question. Is the productivity of our firm increasing as rapidly as you see on these charts? Now, in agriculture, we had 70% of all of our laborers working on the farm 100 years ago. Today, that figure is less than 2%, about 1.8%. And the reason is because of productivity increases. Same thing happened in manufacturing, and now it's beginning to happen in software programming and architecture, pharmacy, and everything else. Productivity is the name of the game. And we haven't moved factories to other places very much. A lot of people think we have. We really haven't. What we've done is we've moved the labor that was in the factories into machines, not so much moving the factories into other countries. It's very rare. It happens, but it's not often. But the only way that a highly prosperous country can compete with the low labor rates of other countries is to take the labor out of the manufacturing process, and that's exactly what's happening in prosperous countries. And if you want to be a prosperous entrepreneur, in the long run, that's the way you grow your firm to a large firm, is to increasingly be more productive. And that's really the solution. Now, for every problem, there is a solution. And if you look at this slide, I think you would agree with me, it's not necessarily an easy solution. And some of the solutions that people propose are a little shaky to it. But what I have done is write a new book that just came out. It was just launched Thursday of this week. And it addresses the problem of how do you solve the problems in an economy. This is called macroeconomic issues. And the answer, and because we have an enormous problem in America. We have less and less jobs every year. The proportion of people who are working, the proportion of the civilian labor force who actually have jobs, is going down every year, especially for men. We had a recession in 2008 called a man session. 75 or 80% of all the people who were laid off during the recession were men. In a factory economy, you couldn't do that. You needed men to lift those heavy boxes. Well, you don't need that anymore. And so we're replacing laborers with machines. And where are the jobs going to come from then? And the answer is from small and mid-level firms, which start with 1 or 5 employees, and then grow larger and add new employees faster than they add machines. It was interesting, Sweden did an experiment about 20 years ago in which they started teaching entrepreneurship courses in high school. And a study was done 10 years later, and actually 1 out of every 5 students who took those high school courses in entrepreneurship had actually started a business with an average of 5 employees. And if you've been noticing, the Swedish economy is much better than it was just a few years ago. In fact, it's becoming competitive with tax rates and other things with the U.S. now. And one of the reasons is because they're starting small firms which are adding employees. And that's the kind of way that firms solve the economic, macroeconomic problems, is to have small firms add 1 or 2 or 3 employees. Now, I use the term garage entrepreneurs. And now, from a theoretical standpoint, this is a conflict between Keynes, the English economist, and Schumpeter, the Austrian economist. And the way to keep those two straight is Keynes was on the left and Schumpeter was on the right, as you can see from the book titles. But Keynes said you can manage the economy by the government, and you can take the business cycles and make them not happen, which Keynes writes really, really well, and the theories don't work so well. Schumpeter, on the other hand, said it's small businesses who are creatively destroying the big old businesses that keep an economy dynamic. And I call these people garage entrepreneurs. The most, the reason, one of the most famous of those was in a garage in Palo Alto, California. That is in what's called Silicon Valley in the U.S. And Hewlett and Packard, two men, in 1939 started a firm called Hewlett Packard in a garage with $538. And the most successful entrepreneurs start with very limited capital. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes they literally start in the garage. Why? Because they keep their expenses low. Now, in this new book called Saving America, and I hope to write a sequel called Saving Bulgaria. And maybe if a lot of you learn some ideas here and you become billionaires, I can come and study you and write the new sequel, Saving Bulgaria. And these are people, you might recognize some of them, you might not. Probably the interesting one up on the upper left, his name is Les Wexner, and I'll tell you more about them. But his Forbes says he is worth $5.7 billion. Now, where did he get the capital to become that rich? And the answer, he lived in a shanty on the east side of Columbus. He had no money. He had an aunt in Chicago who allowed him to borrow $5,000 on the agreement that he would not actually spend it. He should use it as collateral to finance inventory, and then he sold the inventory fast enough to make a profit and gradually grow. Now he's worth $5 billion. And that's what garage entrepreneurs do. They get their capital from their customers. The man on the right is the guy who started a little company, and his family is now the richest family in the world. If you can tell me, how many people recognize the man with the cap?
Who recognizes the man with the cap? Go ahead, somebody wants to say something. Go ahead.
Walmart.
She says it's Walmart. I think she wants to say it's Sam Walton.
It is Sam Walton. She's right. She wins the free prize for today.
You win the prize.
And his family's wealth, because they still own 47% of Walmart, is worth $500 billion. $500 billion. The richest family in the world by far. And he started with one little store, and 95% of it just from his savings that accumulated. And he didn't start that firm until he was 45 years old. And let's get a show of hands. How many there are under 45? How many people in the room are under 45? Any?
Raise your hand if you're under 45, if you're willing to it. Even some who might not be raised their hand.
Okay. Well, there's still time. There's still time for them to become the richest family in the world then. Because Walton did not start his firm until he was 45 years old. The person in the blue shirt is Michael Dell. And I worked with him, and what he did is he did not invent a new product, he invented a new supply chain. And the person in the right-hand corner is named Dave Thomas, who did not graduate from high school. Neither did Michael Dell. Michael Dell only went 1 year, and he started his business in his dormitory room called Dell Computers. Dave Thomas was an adopted baby and never knew his birth parents. And his adoptive parents, his mother died at 10, and his father couldn't hold a job, and so he never got to go to school. But he joined the U.S. Army to learn to be a cook, and was a cook. And he learned to cook hamburgers better than anybody else. And he started a firm called Wendy's, and became extremely wealthy. The man in the lower right-hand corner is named John McConnell, and his car, he paid cash for it. He was the son of a steel worker, so he understood steel, but he had no money. So he got a loan on his car and started selling scrap steel and special steel out of the trunk of his car. and he just died a couple years ago, worth a couple of $1 billion, and his firm's a multi-billion-dollar firm called Worthington Steel. The woman on the right, she was here at my house for the launch of this book called Saving America. Her name is Cheryl Kruger. She started selling cookies in her kitchen, and when she sold 6,000 of them one year at Christmas, she decided there might be a business there, and she went on and she sold that business for $50 million to a company called 1-800-Flowers. And we sat around and had coffee and enjoyed some of her cookies last Thursday night in my house. And the same thing happened with this man in the middle next to the other woman. His name is Pete Kite. He started a firm called Check Free, which sort of invented electronic funds transfer so that people could pay their utility bills out of their bank account. The banks didn't invent that. People didn't invent it. Pete did. And I put a few $1,000s into his firm back in the 1980s. And we're sitting around in my house Thursday night launching this new book. And my house is fairly large, actually. And it costs only a few $1,000s because I sold the stock for a few $1 million and paid the house in this company called Check Free. Even after taxes, I don't know anything on my house because I invested in entrepreneurs like Cheryl Kruger and like Pete Kite's Check Free and like John McConnell's Worthington Steel and like Wendy's Dave Thomas. And actually, I've invested in every one of those that you see, and that's, you don't have to be an entrepreneur to make a lot of money. You just have to understand entrepreneurs and then invest in the ones that are going to be successful. And that's what this book, Saving America, is all about. And the woman over on the left is named Bridget Murphy. And in the 1850s in America, she came to the U.S. as an immigrant. And her husband died and left her with 2 small children when she was 37. And she had no skills or education or anything, so she worked as a servant girl and in a grocery store and accumulated enough money to, when the couple who owned it and gave her a job retired, she actually bought the store and then bought the building and then brought her son into the building. And since grocery stores back then sold liquor, she helped her son start a tavern. And he started selling liquor on a wholesale basis and became one of the richest persons in America and one of the most successful political families. Has anybody there guessed her last name? Her name was Kennedy. You're looking at the grandmother of John F. Kennedy. And she started it because there were no government programs to give anything, so she had neighbors look after her kids until they were old enough to put them work in the store herself. And she took the very small amounts of money she could accumulate running a little grocery store and helped her son get started, and that's how the Kennedy dynasty in the U.S. got started. And here's the interesting thing is, every one of those billionaires that you're looking at started with nothing. 70% of all billionaires in the U.S. started as poor people. If somebody asks me, how do you become rich? The answer is, well, you have to start poor. But rich people tend to lose the money instead of make more. And poor people are the ones that make. In fact, if you take the 20% poorest people in the U.S. by income, and you look at them 20 years later, 60% of them are in the top 40%. What happens is we always have the poor people with us. We'll always have the poor, there's no doubt about that, but they're not the same people. They change over time. How do they change? Well, there are 11 principles of how to grow small and medium-sized firms into large fortunes. The principles are these. Centrifugal growth, market segmentation, functional shiftability, global thinking, brand management, how to create delighted customers. You see, it's not enough in a consumer-driven society to have satisfied customers. Today, customers must be delighted, not just satisfied. Design strategy, and I may not have time to talk much about that, but that's what Steve Jobs did at Apple. He built the company around design strategy. He didn't study design, but designers study Steve Jobs. And anyone who wants to create a fortune, become a billionaire, can use that concept to do that. Now, cash is king. In this book, I have a chapter named Cash is King. And the best time to borrow money from a bank is when you don't need it. And you want to do it before the recession occurs, not during it. And the principle is you want to build fast, collect fast, and pay slow. But that's a fine line, and if you don't do it well, you can wreck your business. It's very difficult to learn because you don't want to collect so fast that you alienate or make your customers unhappy. And so you really do have to learn how to do that. I have another chapter in this book called You Win with People. You hire, the entrepreneurs that are most successful are the ones who build a team. And the best entrepreneurs learn what's called servant leadership. And there are some books called Servant Leadership. I talked about it in the chapter, but the New Testament of the Bible actually has the best example of servant leadership, and it's an organization that, I don't know, grew quite a bit over the last couple of centuries, a couple of millennium actually. And then, how do you know which entrepreneurs are going to really take off and be the next Walmarts or the next Apples? The chapter on the S-curve of entrepreneurial growth describes that. And the final chapter is how anyone can be an Einstein. And Einstein once was asked, what's the most important theory in the world? Einstein people thought he would say the theory of relativity. He didn't. He said it's the theory of compound annual growth. Well, these are the major theories, and I'll only have time this morning, maybe another 15 minutes or so, to talk about some of them. And these are the ones that you can use to take a smaller, successful firm and make it extremely successful into a large fortune. And if you do it really well, maybe you'll do it like the Bashalandura shopping center in Bangladesh, in which they built one of the largest shopping centers in the world. And since they don't have any space in Bangladesh, they had to build up 22 stories. And they did three things. They created middle-class families because there's 2,500 family-owned firms in that shopping center. So you created a very prosperous middle class. The man who built the shopping center became a billionaire, and you have you have tens of millions of people who used to live on a farm, live in the cities now, but they make $300 a month instead of $30 a month, and they buy food and clothes and so forth instead of growing it themselves. These are the three principles that allows that kind of thing to happen. And you want to grow firms, you either can go to more markets, you can take market share away from competitors, or you can make more margin on the products you sell now. All of those will allow you to grow your firm. One of the most valuable concepts is called market segmentation. We have a chapter on that in the Saving America book. And what that means is dividing the total market into smaller, relatively homogeneous groups. And you see, the reason we have market segmentation, if everybody was the same, all products would be the same. That's called market aggregation. And everybody would want the exact same thing. But if every customer is different, if all people are unique, then every product should be different. The problem is that would be very expensive to do. It is possible. If you go to a certain retailers, you can actually buy a custom-built suit that is exactly right for your unique dimensions. Or you can go to a Walmart or other types of stores, Carrefour, various ones, and you buy it off the rack. Now that's not going to fit you quite as well as the one that's uniquely built for you, but which one's going to be the least expensive to make? And market segmentation is finding the balance between making products that are all the same and the ones that are unique, not to every individual, but to certain groups of individuals. And we can do that for people, or we can do it for institutions. And what you want is people with sufficient purchasing power, the willingness to buy your product, and the authority to buy it. When you find a specific segment of the consumers most likely to purchase a product, you go after them, and you do it so much better than the firms that have something for everyone that you become a billionaire. That's the principle of market segmentation. And you see, if you look at these people, everybody's different. There's no two people in the whole world the similar. And if you don't believe that, look at fingerprints or DNA. Now, if you build a product for everybody, those products would all be different. But if you do a market segmentation approach, you might do it, and you might say, well, there's one thing that 3 of them have in common. It's their gender. They're males. And another 3, they're all females. And you would certainly find differences. Even though there's very big differences between those individuals, in other ways, they're enough that you might develop a product just for females or just for males. And people make a fortune that way. You could segment by age. In some ways, the older man and woman on the left are more like each other than the boy and the girl on the right. And there are many ways to segment, but you're going to find that the riches are in the niches. And that's called market segmentation. You really don't want to segment by demographics so much, but by behavior. And you look at what the behavior is, and today we increasingly do that with analytics and data mining, scanning data, POS data, point of sale data, and credit card and loyalty data. And when you put all those together, you do customer relationship management, and there's a lot of software to do that. Best selling in the world is probably Salesforce.com. But what you really want is how people are buying. What's they're using the product. That's the behavior. You use demographics to reach them, but they're only proxies, and not very good proxies, for what you really want to measure, which is behavior. In order to do it, you must present measurable purchasing power. You must find a way to promote and service that market segment. Now, increasingly, you can do that across national boundaries because of online marketing. I can find lots of examples of companies that are, we have a company that I've been working with a little bit, an entrepreneur here, that sell fly fishing rods. Now, these rods sell for several $1,000s. And it doesn't matter what country in the world is, there's some people who to go fly fishing. And this company happens to be based in Columbus, Ohio, called Mad River Outfitters, can sell through most of the world. Now, there's not a whole lot of people wanting to buy a $3,000 fly fishing rod in any one country, but you add up across all countries in the world, and it's a big market. And you can do that increasingly today with online marketing. And it has to be large enough to make profit. And you have to get those segments to match with your marketing capability, which often means you change how you market. You see, actually, marketing and selling is often confused. Selling is getting rid of what you make. Marketing is making what you can get rid of, what you can sell. That's the difference between selling and marketing. Now, let me give you an example of market segmentation. I told you that Mr. Wexner was worth $5.7 billion. How did he get that wealthy? He started off with nothing, except an aunt who loaned him $4,000 to start this store. Now, he could have sold to both men and women, but he didn't, because he knew women buy 3 times as much clothing as men do. So why would you want to sell to men? You want to sell to women, possible. In the 1960s, he sold to women who were age 17 to 25. Why? Those were called baby boomers, and that was the fast-growing, 3 times faster than the rest of the population. And so he segmented to that age group. And he sold to sportswear instead of dress-up clothing. You might say, well, why would you want to sell at all? Well, the answer is because sportswear turns over or sells 3 times faster. You don't want to sell products that don't turn over rapidly. You want to sell high turnover products. And those firms make the most money. And then he sold to middle-income women, not high-income. Why not? You might say, why not high-income women? Well, because there's not enough of them to make much money. If you sell to the class, you live in the mass. But if you sell in the mass, you live in the class. And he wanted to sell to a lot of people. And so he sold to middle-income people. Because there's not enough high-income people. You might say, well, why did he sell to low-income people? Because they don't have money. This is not rocket science. And he limited his offering, and that's how he came up with the name, of course. He called the term the limited. Now, here's what he did that is different in applying this concept. He evolved with the first segment and then added new segments. When his 17 to 25-year-old women, 10 years later, were 10 years older, he made that store more sophisticated, a little bit higher price points, and a couple sizes larger. Well, that left room in the market for a new concept. It could have been a competitor, but he was smart enough to be his own competition. You know, it's best when your most effective competitor is yourself. And he started one called Express for the younger women. And then, you know, I told you he didn't sell to the low-income people. Well, he found a store in New York City that did, called Learner Shops. And he bought that. The store had been around since many years. He bought that and upgraded it to make it a much more successful one, adding the low income. And then there are women who wear size 12 and higher. He calls them real women. And he found a firm called Lane Bryant who appealed to them, and he made it much more fashionable. And then he bought a firm that had been around since 1892 that was bankrupt, called Abercrombie & Fitch, that made very high clothing. But they were in bankruptcy. They only had 3 stores left. They sold safari wear and stuff. And he bought that for $7 million. And in fact, he asked me to go on their board of directors, and I was on the board of directors while we grew Abercrombie & Fitch. Then he found a firm that was close to bankruptcy in San Francisco called Victoria's Secret. I won't ask for a show of hands, but I bet a bunch of you have seen Victoria's Secret runway show. And I should tell you that I was actually on the board of directors of Victoria's Secret also. Yes, I did go to the runway show. I consider that part of my fiduciary responsibility.
That's very good. You know, Roger, just to let you know, we have about 10 minutes to go.
Okay, good. Now, you see, what he did is he has a collection appealing to different segments. And all of these today accumulate sales of $10 billion. And he created jobs for 19,000 people using the concept of market segmentation. And he continues to grow, and he has now started another brand called Pink, which is another $1 billion. And he acquired a firm in Canada called La Senza. And Henry Bendel is growing. And these are the kinds of ways you grow. Now, market segmentation can also be geography. I told you Sam Walton was 45 years old when he started his first store. That's a picture of it. And he's one store. He borrowed the idea from Kmart.
Most people don't make much money when they invent products. They make their money by perfecting other people's ideas. And you don't have to be the best, you just have to perfect other people's. And I wrote a book once called Brands That Rock. And I talked about how Kiss was this rock musician who wasn't a very good musician. And so they went to small towns and had fireworks and all kinds of things. And became successful because they were the hottest act in rural America there was. They couldn't compete in the cities. Well, Walton did the same thing. He couldn't have competed against Sears and the department stores, so he stayed in small towns. And who would you rather compete with, Sears and Roebuck or Harry's Hardware? And then he got stronger and stronger and stronger, and his strategy was to go to the big cities afterward. A smart general does not attack a superior force. He flanks the competitor. And that's what Sam Walton did. And you might say, well, that worked in America. Does it work anyplace else? Yeah, it's working around the world, basically. Anywhere there's a lot of people who want clothes and groceries and lots of other things. And he did it with certain rules. One of them was the 5 feet rule. No customer is supposed to come into the store and be within 5 feet of an employee without a friendly greeting. He asked 2 questions. Sam Walton asked everybody that worked for him, what are our competitors doing better than we are? And then he took whatever his competitors were doing better and adapted it, or adopted it, and that way you end up the best in the world. The other question he asked was, what have you read lately that would make our organization better managed than other firms? And the people who are the most successful read the most books. Over and over, the great entrepreneurs read a lot. And Sam Walton said, I'm not a very smart person myself, but I know that all these smart people write down things I need to know in books. And you know what? I don't think that some of my competitors read those books. And so if I read what all the smart people know, I become smarter than my competitors. And that's how you become the richest person in the world, which he did. And sometimes people say, what book should I read? And the number one book I recommend is Good to Great. Later, if you have time, go to my website, which is RogerBlackwellBusiness.com, and you'll see a list of books that I believe every business person should read by age 30. But if you haven't read them and you're over 30, it's still okay. And you'll see also my books on there too. The second concept is functional shiftability. And what that means is you shift logistics and technology to the most effective place in the supply chain. Now, in the old supply chain, we call them supply chain, but we're shifting them to demand chain. What happened was, over on the left, a manufacturer would decide what to make, what brand to put on it, and how to ship it to a distributor, wholesaler, dealer, and the distributor would ship it to a retailer, and the retailer to the customer. And that's all very inefficient, and it begins with the mind of the manufacturers, based on past experience and resources. Today, that's all shifting. And these are some of the firms that are doing that. One of the most effective in the world is Aldi. In my new book, I have a chapter about how Aldi uses the principle of velocity and expense control to become the largest grocery store chain in the world. And what they have done is taking all the functions, transporting, warehousing, stocking, delivery, buying, selling, procurement, and putting them under their control as channel commander instead of the manufacturers and wholesalers. And a lot of these can be done online, and increasingly that's the way it's happening. Remember, in e-commerce, the E stands for the easy part. It's the commerce. So we really should call e-commerce Commerce E. It would make it a lot more sensible about who is going to be successful in converting supply chains to demand chains, which I call mind to market or demand chains. And I wrote a couple of books. You'll see those on my website about those. And the fortunate thing is those can be purchased used for $1 or $2. So You'll probably find them easily. Well, these are the three big concepts that grow firms from small to large: market segmentation, functional shiftability, and global thinking. Global thinking simply means the ability to understand markets beyond your own domestic country, and also how to source beyond your domestic country, and also the management processes and techniques that work across the world. And it starts with the values of the company. I told you about the limited. L Brands is their current name, and here's what they believe. They are a value-based organization. The customer rules. Passion leads to success. You strive for excellence, both emotionally, intellectually, and also spiritually. Inclusion of diverse types of people makes us stronger, and it matters how we play the game. We play it with integrity. You see, when I invest in companies, my new book is really about how to grow firms, but it's also for investors. Because I invested in the limited, I didn't invest as early as I'd like to, but if I invested $1,000 when he went public, you know how much that would be worth today? $50 million. You don't have to be an entrepreneur. If you can scrape together $1,000 and you understand why some entrepreneurs are successful and others are not, which is what my book is about, then you can do that. Same thing with Walmart. If you could have waited 10 years after he went public, put $5,000 in it, it would be worth $3 million today. And that's what this book is about, is saving America. And I'm hoping it's useful in saving Bulgaria as well. And basically, the reality is, when you talk about any nation, it's the people who make the difference. And I think I'm back. You can see me on my face now, right?
Almost. Actually, we're seeing me.
Oh, look, okay. If I do screen share, do we see me?
I'm requesting assistance. Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, there you are. You're back. Okay.
Okay.
Are you ready to take a couple of questions?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You can see me. You okay?
Oops, you hit the wrong, you hit a button that you came off.
Okay. Press the green button again. I will do that. I just did it. Is that?
I think it's coming.
You hear it now?
Yeah, that works.
The audience there is probably saying, "Oh, we prefer the slides more than looking at this."
I think it was a very useful talk. May I ask the audience if they have a question for Roger? Will they? When and how will your book be available? Can we get it?
It is available. It's available on Amazon.
Available.
And, that's probably the easiest way to get it.
Okay, very good. We do have a couple questions now.
Okay.
Presentation.
Well, yes, we have.
Now, can you see me drinking my coffee also?
Yes, you may. The question is, may we have access to the presentation? And I believe you've agreed to let us share your slide deck with the participants. Is that correct?
Yes, and I don't know whether you have been able to download it there or not. I have tried to send it by email, but the file is so big that it doesn't usually email because it's very large. But we can figure out the best way to do that. You're very welcome to look at this.
Very good. Yes, I think they're optimistic that they'll be able to get this figured out. Our technology team there is first class.
I did try to send the PowerPoint yesterday, and it didn't go through because of the file size, but we'll figure that out.
Yeah, I'm told that they will think of something, so that's good. Okay, I do have. Here's another question.
Good.
You said that if you change the values of the people, you can change the prosperity. Like that, you said that the prosperity is in the qualities. That means that change the possibility?
Well, prosperity will have its effect on values also, and we don't probably think about that as much as we should. But we do find, for example, that if you come from a very prosperous, rich family, you probably won't be as good an entrepreneur as if you come from a poor family. Entrepreneurs have told me that it's easy to compete against a competitor with a son or daughter that's running the firm, inherited and is rich. But if the person went to a good school, got a good education, even though that person came from a poor family, you have a junkyard dog to compete with. And he will eat your meat if you're not careful. And so basically, that seems to be prosperity creating values. And lots of times we talk about people who are, we use terms, and I don't like this term, who are prosperous and dumb and happy. But the fact is, and it's happening in China and Bangladesh and elsewhere today, people who rise up from the bottom and get to the top are the ones who are creating the new jobs and making the business very effective. Now, how you get people motivated to do that is the values. And that's difficult. And I can tell you a book that tells you exactly how to do it. Lee Kuan Yew, in the Prime of Singapore, President of Singapore, wrote his book and explained that, and he did it. And he focused on the values. There are 3 values. If you get my book called From the Edge of the World, I have a chapter on Singapore, which is a very elementary description of what he's done. But read his book and you see how he did it. If you read the book Built to Last by Collins and Forrest, you will see how to create the values that will make your own firm much more successful than competitors who don't have the right values. And there is such a thing as the right values. They will vary from firm to firm, from nation to nation. But if you don't have the right values, don't expect to be as prosperous as the people who do. And I'm not talking about moral values. I'm talking about diligence and things like that. That was a good question. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that's an interesting question. I think it's easier to become a billionaire in a nation with 700 or with 300 million people than it is with 7 million people. That's for certain. However, a millionaire, I really don't have enough knowledge to comment on how easy it is in Bulgaria. One of my PhD students was from Romania, and she told me some things about Bulgaria, but I don't know enough about it really. And do you trust any Roma's opinion about Bulgaria anyway? But we're finding that most of the new billionaires in the world are in countries not the United States. A lot of them are in China. Some of them are in countries like Bangladesh. Some of them, I hope, are in Bulgaria, but I don't know that. And if you take the concept of garage entrepreneurs, you don't start with much capital, so it doesn't take a lot of money. In fact, I have a chapter on why most entrepreneurs fail, and the answer is TMC, too much capital. The reason is because they try to please the investors instead of the customers. And if you just take and start in your garage or basement or kitchen, you start baking cookies, then you become like Cheryl Kruger. And when somebody one year so many people ask her about the cookies that she sold 6,000 cookies. She realized she had a business. And that's the way to do it, is to start small and grow large. And if you have a lot of outside capital, people start large and grow small, or not at all. And that happens. The firms that have a lot of capital usually fail. And in time, sometimes people say, well, I was just undercapitalized. But they're not undercapitalized, they're overexpensed, almost always. So I wish you good success, and if you do become a millionaire, would you send me an email and I'll put you in my next book.
Thank you, Roger. I think we're going to let you get on with your morning. It's now about 4:30 our time and probably 9:30 yours. Thank you for sharing your great story with this group. I do suspect...
I still have time to go to church this morning.
You know, if the averages hold up, I do suspect in this room we'll have some future millionaires. So I think you might get that email.
Good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.